I want to walk you through what's actually happening here, because the mainstream coverage isn't capturing the full gravity of this situation. Canada, our closest ally, our neighbor, the country with whom we share the longest undefended border in the world, is now actively preparing for the possibility of military conflict with the United States. This isn't speculation from fringe commentators. This is coming from Canadian military leadership, from members of Parliament, from serious analysts who are looking at Donald Trump's rhetoric and comparing it directly to the playbook Vladimir Putin used before he sent tanks rolling into Ukraine. When General Marie Karanen, the head of Canadian forces, gives end-of-year interviews saying Canada is ready to go if needed. That's not posturing. That's a warning. Let me be very clear about what I'm seeing in Trump's language, because language matters, especially when it comes from the most powerful person in the world. He's calling Canada the 51st state, which Canadians correctly interpret as a direct threat of annexation. He's claiming that fentanyl is pouring across the Canadian border and killing Americans, a claim that has no basis in reality when you look at where fentanyl actually enters the country. He's suggesting that the border between our nations is somehow arbitrary, that these are really American lands. This is the exact rhetorical framework that Putin used against Ukraine. First, you delegitimize the sovereignty of your neighbor. Then you manufacture grievances. Then you claim you're protecting your own people from threats that don't actually exist. The parallels to Putin's pre-invasion rhetoric are so striking that I'm genuinely concerned. People aren't taking them seriously enough. Putin talked about historical territorial claims, about denazification, about protecting Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. Everyone thought it was absurd. Everyone said, surely a major power wouldn't just invade its neighbor in the 21st century based on fabricated pretexts. And then the tanks rolled in. Now I'm watching Donald Trump use the same linguistic patterns, the same escalatory framework, the same dismissal of established borders and national sovereignty. Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, is publicly stating that World War II has already begun. And where does the United States stand in this new global order? Based on everything we're seeing, we appear to be aligning ourselves with Putin rather than with our democratic allies. What's particularly alarming is how Canada is responding to this threat. They're not just issuing diplomatic protests or hoping this blows over. They're taking concrete steps to build military resilience. The Canadian forces are actively recruiting, exceeding their targets, aiming to grow from roughly 65,000 soldiers to 71,000. But more significantly, they're developing what can only be described as a civilian defense force, potentially 300,000 strong, designed to support the regular military in exactly the kind of hybrid warfare we saw in Ukraine. They're reconsidering their planned purchase of F-35 fighter jets from the United States because they no longer trust that American-made weapon systems won't be used against them or manipulated by a hostile administration. I've been thinking a lot about what happened in the Ukrainian city of Sumy in the opening days of Russia's invasion because I think it offers a template for how Canada is thinking about its own defense. In Sumy, there were only about 50 professional soldiers with limited heavy weapons when the Russian armored columns approached. The city's administration fled, but the ordinary citizens did not. Small teams of defenders went out to disrupt Russian logistics. They used drones. They used whatever they had. And by mid-March, the Russians were afraid to enter the city. This is what a people's defense looks like. And this is exactly what Canadian leaders like Charlie Angus are talking about when they discuss building community resilience, local response teams, and civilian expertise networks. They watched what happened in Ukraine, and they're not going to make the same mistake of assuming it could never happen to them. I keep coming back to this fundamental question that I think every American needs to grapple with. Honestly, if there were no international pushback, if the rest of the world simply looked away, do you have any doubt that Donald Trump would actually try to take military action against Canada? He said as much. The 51st state language isn't a joke. It's not playful diplomatic banter. It's a statement of intent dressed up as casual commentary. And Canadians understand this, even if many Americans want to dismiss it as hyperbole. When you're the target of this kind of rhetoric, You don't have the luxury of assuming the person saying it doesn't really mean it. What strikes me most forcefully is how this fits into the broader pattern of Trump's behavior toward Venezuela, which I think serves as a preview of what he might attempt with Canada. He's now claiming that Venezuela somehow stole American land and American oil, which is a complete fabrication with no historical or legal basis whatsoever. He's saying Venezuelans are shipping fentanyl to America and killing our citizens. Another claim manufactured entirely out of thin air. This is gangster diplomacy, shakedown politics on an international scale. And if you think the language and tactics he's using against Venezuela won't be applied to Canada, you haven't been paying attention to how this man operates. The escalation pattern is clear, and Canada is watching it unfold in real time. The strategic implications of what's happening are staggering when you step back and consider them. Prime Minister Mark Carney has been traveling the world building new economic partnerships and alliances, and he's reporting that virtually every country wants to do more business with Canada. They want to deepen trade relationships. They see Canada as a reliable partner that respects international law and follows established rules. The one exception, of course, is the United States under Trump. We've become the pariah in our own neighborhood, the threat that our closest ally is actively preparing to defend against. How did we get to a place where the world's democracies are desperate to align with Canada while viewing America under Trump as fundamentally untrustworthy? I want to talk about Doug Ford for a moment because I think his response captures something essential about how Canadians are processing this threat. Ford is the Premier of Ontario, a conservative politician who in normal times would be a natural ally of Republican administrations, but when Trump's tariffs started hitting Ontario's steel industry, automotive sector, manufacturing base, and pharmaceutical companies, Ford didn't back down. He authorized that advertisement that ran during the World Series and NFL games, the one that sent Pete Hegseth and the Trump administration into absolute hysterics. Ford's position is simple, and I think entirely correct. His job is to protect the people of Ontario, and he's going to fight like he's never fought before to do exactly that. The fact that even conservative Canadian politicians are now openly confrontational with the Trump administration tells you everything about how thoroughly this relationship has collapsed. The whining from the American side about that Ontario advertisement is genuinely pathetic when you think about it. Pete Hegseth, the United States ambassador to Canada, keeps complaining that a foreign government ran political ads during American election season. But let's be honest about what actually happened here. Trump has been making statements about Canada's elections. He's been trying to influence Canadian political outcomes. He's been threatening a sovereign nation with annexation. And when Ontario responds by running advertisements pointing out the damage Trump's policies are causing, suddenly the Trump administration acts like they're the victims. The lack of self-awareness is breathtaking, but it's also revealing about how thin-skinned authoritarians really are when they face any pushback whatsoever. What really concerns me is the trajectory we're on. If nothing changes, Canada is now looking at purchasing fighter jets from Sweden instead of the United States because they can't trust that American-made weapon systems won't be compromised by a hostile administration. They're building civilian defense networks because they've studied what happened in Ukraine and they understand that conventional military forces alone weren't enough to stop the Russian advance. In those critical early days, they're strengthening economic ties with Europe, Asia, and other partners because they recognize that depending on American trade under Trump is simply too dangerous. We're watching in real time as our most important ally fundamentally reorients its national security strategy around the assumption that the United States may be an adversary rather than a partner. This is catastrophic damage to relationships that took generations to build. I've been studying authoritarian movements and leaders for most of my professional life, and I can tell you that the pattern Trump is following with Canada fits perfectly into the established playbook. First, you dehumanize and delegitimize your target. Then you manufacture economic grievances, claiming they're stealing from you, cheating on trade deals, taking advantage of American generosity. Finally, you position yourself as merely reclaiming what was rightfully yours all along. Putin did exactly this with Ukraine. He talked about protecting Russian speakers. He talked about historical territorial claims. He talked about NATO expansion as an existential threat. And then one morning the invasion began. General Marie Karenin's comments about air defense are particularly revealing about how seriously Canada is taking this threat. She noted that Canada divested from air defense systems back around 2000 because they were fighting counterinsurgency wars and didn't need them. The assumption was that the airspace above North America was secure, protected by the alliance with the United States. But now, as she puts it, the air is contested and Canada needs to get back into the business of air defense. Think about what that statement actually means. The head of Canadian military forces is acknowledging that Canadian airspace may need to be defended, not just from Russian incursions, but potentially from threats coming from the south. This is a fundamental transformation in how Canada views its security environment. The civilian army concept that Canadian leaders are developing is fascinating and I think represents a genuine innovation in democratic defense strategy. Charlie Angus describes it as building networks of expertise to support the military, including civil service, emergency management, and community resilience teams. They're talking about training ordinary citizens in first aid, IT, radio communications, search and rescue, evacuation procedures, and emergency traffic management. The idea is that in a crisis, you can't wait for the slow machinery of military bureaucracy to respond. You need people at the ground level who are already trained and ready to act. The example Angus gives is instructive. During the COVID pandemic, when the Canadian government initially planned to use existing employment insurance infrastructure to get emergency funds to citizens, the New Democratic Party argued this would take forever. Over Easter weekend, Canadian civil servants created the CERB program from scratch and got $2,000 to every person who couldn't work quickly and efficiently. That's the kind of creative, nimble response they're trying to build into their defense posture. What happened in Sumy should be studied by everyone trying to understand how civilian populations can resist overwhelming military force. When Russian armored columns approached the city, there were only about 50 professional soldiers with very limited heavy weapons. The Russians were so confident that they didn't even bother bringing air defenses to support their troops. And then they encountered something they weren't prepared for. Small teams of ordinary citizens with rifles, a few dozen anti-tank weapons, no armored vehicles, no heavy weaponry, but absolute determination to defend their homes. They used drones. They targeted logistics. They made it impossible for the Russians to operate safely in the area. By mid-March, Russian soldiers were terrified to enter the city. This is the model Canada is studying because they understand that if the worst happens, they may need to implement something similar. The international dimension of this crisis is something Americans aren't thinking about enough. When Carney travels abroad, every country except one wants to strengthen ties with Canada. Europe sees Canada as a reliable democratic partner. Asian nations want trade deals. Australia and other Commonwealth nations are deepening their relationships with Ottawa. Meanwhile, the United States, under Trump, is isolating itself from the democratic world and aligning with authoritarian powers. Lavrov says World War II has already begun in a new form, a war of economic pressure, hybrid warfare, and strategic competition. And in that war, the United States appears to be fighting on the wrong side. I want to address something directly that I know many Americans are thinking. Surely this is all just rhetoric. Surely Trump wouldn't actually try to invade Canada. It's preposterous. That's exactly what everyone said about Putin and Ukraine. Canada is looking at Trump's behavior, listening to his words, watching what he's doing in Venezuela, and they're drawing the obvious conclusion. They can't afford to assume the best. They have to prepare for the worst. What gives me some hope is that Canada isn't backing down. Doug Ford is still fighting. Mark Carney is building international coalitions. The Canadian military is preparing seriously for contingencies that would have seemed absurd just a few years ago. Charlie Angus and others are organizing civilian resilience networks. The F-35 situation encapsulates the tragedy of this moment perfectly. Canada fought alongside the United States in Afghanistan. They've trained with us, shared intelligence with us, integrated their defense systems with ours, and now they're seriously considering buying Swedish fighters because they no longer trust the United States. The path forward requires Americans to wake up to what's actually happening. This isn't normal diplomatic friction. This isn't tough negotiating tactics. This is authoritarian expansionism turned against democratic allies. Everything happening right now was predictable. The warnings were right. The institutions failed, and history will judge this moment harshly.